Just before you think women don't commit crimes, know that more than 570 women have been executed in the U.S. Many of these executions took place in the last century. While some died by electrocution, others were hanged or put to death in gas chambers. Here are the women executed in the 20th century, including their crime, last meal, and final words. Christina Marie Riggs. State: Arkansas. Date of execution: May 2nd, 2000. Christina was convicted of the murder of her 2 children in November 1997. Justin Dalton Thomas was just 5 years old, and Shelby Alexis Riggs was 2 years old. Riggs was a licensed practical nurse at the time and had planned to kill the children with substances obtained from her hospital. When she injected her son with potassium chloride, it resulted in pain but didn't lead to death. To achieve her aim, she smothered both children to death, then attempted suicide. She was convicted and sentenced to death. On Sunday, April 30th, 2000, Riggs was flown from McPherson to Cummins in preparation for her execution. Her last words were, "No words can express just how sorry I am for taking the lives of my babies. No way I can make up for or take away the pain I have caused everyone who knew and loved them. I love you, my babies." Her last meal was a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. She was put to death by an injection of potassium chloride at 9:28 p.m. on the 2nd of May, year 2000. Betty Lou Beets. State: Texas. Date of execution: February 24th, 2000. Betty Lou Beets was convicted of shooting her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, on August 6, 1983. Beets was put to death by lethal injection at 6:18 p.m. on February 24, 2000, at the Huntsville unit. She did not request a final meal or make a final statement. Judy Buenoano. State: Florida. Date of execution: March 30th, 1998. Judias was an American serial killer. She was executed in Florida for the murder of her first husband, James Goodyear, which took place in 1971. Additionally, she was convicted of the murder of her son, Michael Buenoano, in 1980, and for the attempted murder of her boyfriend, John Gentry, in 1983. She was held on death row for women at the Broward Correctional Institution, part of the Florida Department of Corrections. On March 30th, 1998, Buenoano was executed in the electric chair at the Florida State Prison. Her last meal consisted of steamed broccoli, asparagus, strawberries, tomato wedges, hot tea, and lemon. When asked if she had any last words, Buenoano said, "No, sir." Carla Faye Tucker. State: Texas. Date of execution: February 3rd, 1998. Carla Faye Tucker was an American woman sentenced to death for killing 2 people with a pickaxe during a burglary. In preparation for her execution, state authorities took Tucker from the unit in Gatesville and flew her on a TDCJ aircraft to the Huntsville unit. Tucker requested a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing for her last meal. Her last words were, "I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry Dean's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." She looked at her husband and said, "Baby, I love you." She looked at Ronald Carlson. "Ron, give Peggy a hug for me." She looked at the people weeping and smiling. "Everybody has been so good to me. I love all of you very much. I am going to be face to face with Jesus now." After the deadly chemicals were administered, 8 minutes later, she was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. Velma Barfield. State: North Carolina. Date of execution: November 2nd, 1984. Margie Velma Barfield was an American serial killer who was convicted of a case of murder but eventually confessed to 6 others. She was the first woman in the United States to be executed after the 1976 resumption of capital punishment and the first to die by lethal injection. Barfield was executed on the 2nd of November, 1984, at Central Prison. Before her execution, she made a statement. "I know that everyone has endured a great deal of pain, all the families involved, and I am sorry. I also want to thank everyone who has supported me during these 6 years." Her final meal consisted of cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. Elizabeth Duncan. State: California. Date of execution: August 8, 1962. Elizabeth Ann Duncan was an American murderer. She was convicted of orchestrating the murder of her daughter-in-law in 1958. Duncan hired 24-year-old Augustine Baldonado and 23-year-old Luis Moya to murder her daughter-in-law, Olga Duncan, who was 7 months pregnant at the time. All three were executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison on August 8, 1962, the last triple execution in California. Her last words were, "I am innocent. Where is Frank?" Rhonda Martin. Date of execution: October 11, 1957. Rhonda Bell Martin was executed by the state of Alabama for the murder of Claude Carroll Martin, her fourth husband, in 1951. Martin's method of murder was rat poison. She was also accused of poisoning and murdering her mother, as well as 5 of her 7 children, all of whom were below the age of 12 at their deaths. Only one of her victims, her former stepson and 5th husband, Ronald Martin, was known to have survived. Although she initially confessed to all the murders, she later recanted her confession when questioned about her children's deaths. 7 hours before her execution, Martin had a last meal consisting of a hamburger, mashed potatoes, cinnamon rolls, and coffee. On the 11th of October, 1957, Martin was escorted to Alabama's electric chair with a Bible in her hand. She appeared calm, though tears fell silently during her execution as she recited the 23rd Psalm with the prison chaplain. She chose not to give a final statement. The first shock was administered at 12:10 in the morning, and she was declared dead at 12:16 in the morning. She was taken out of the death chamber at 12:25 in the morning. Barbara Graham. State: California. Date of execution: June 3, 1955. Barbara was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin Prison on the same day as 2 convicted accomplices, Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins. They were involved in a robbery that led to the murder of an elderly widow. Nicknamed Bloody Babs by the press, Graham was the 3rd woman in California to be executed by gas. At 11:28 a.m., she was led from her cell and strapped in the gas chamber. She requested a blindfold so she would not have to look at the observers. Her last words were, "Good people are always so sure they're right." Barbara Graham's last meal was a steak and a salad. Betty Butler. Date of execution: Betty was found guilty of murdering Evelyn Clark, who had provided shelter for her and her 2 children, Quo Vadis and Donald. Clark had proposed to pay Betty and her children to stay with her in exchange for sexual favors, an offer Betty accepted since she was in desperate financial circumstances. The pair experienced many domestic disagreements, which ultimately led to the murder. Betty assaulted Clark until she lost consciousness and then drowned her in a lake. Betty claimed she was defending herself from Clark's unwanted advances. However, other testimonies indicated that Betty was bisexual and had killed Clark out of anger over her interest in another woman. She was 26 years old when she was executed in the electric chair. Date of execution: January 15, 1954. Dovie Dean, also known as Blanche Dean, was a 55-year-old grandmother from Claremont County, Ohio. She was convicted of killing a 69-year-old individual and was executed in Ohio on January 15, 1954. Dovie Dean's last meal consisted of roast chicken, potatoes, asparagus, a green salad with French dressing, coconut cream pie, angel food cake, and coffee. Her last words were not recorded. Bonnie Heady. State: Missouri. Date of execution: December 1953. Bonnie Heady was involved in the 1953 kidnapping and murder of Bobby Greenlease in Kansas City, Missouri. Heady and her accomplice, Carl Austin Hall, were sentenced to death and executed in Missouri's gas chamber in December 1953. Her last words were, "Are you doing all right, honey?" To her executioner, before the gas began seeping into the room. There was no record of her last meal. Earl Dennison. State, Alabama. Date of execution, September 4th, 1953. Earl Dennison was convicted of first-degree murder for poisoning her 2.5-year-old niece, Shirley Diane Weldon, with arsenic. She was executed in the electric chair on September 4th, 1953, making her the first white woman to be put to death in the electric chair in Alabama. Her last words were, "God has forgiven me for all I have done. Please forgive me for what I did. I forgive everyone." There was no record of her last meal. Ethel Rosenberg. State, New York. Date of execution, June 19, 1953. Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Rosenberg were an American married couple who were convicted of spying for the Soviet Union, including providing top-secret information about American radar, sonar, jet propulsion engines, and nuclear weapon designs. Convicted of espionage in 1951, they were executed by the federal government of the United States in 1953 using New York's state execution chamber in Sing Sing, located in Ossining. Martha Beck. State, New York. Date of execution, March 8, 1951. Raymond Martinez Fernandez and Martha Jewel Beck were an American couple who became serial killers. They were found guilty of one murder, but are believed to have committed 2 additional killings, with suspicions surrounding them for up to 20 victims during a period from 1947 to 1949. After their arrest and trial, they were dubbed the Lonely Hearts Killers because they met their unsuspecting victims through personal ads placed in a newspaper's Lonely Hearts section. The couple strongly denied the 17 murders linked to them, and Fernandez attempted to withdraw his confession, claiming he made it to protect Beck. They were sent to New York, where the death penalty was still enforced. They were tried for just one murder, and both received death sentences. They were executed at Sing Sing Prison on March 8, 1951. Louise Peete. Date of execution, April 11, 1947. Louise was first convicted of the 1920 murder of wealthy mining engineer Jacob C. Denton and was sentenced to life in prison in 1921. However, she was paroled in April 1939. In May 1945, Peete was convicted a second time for murdering her employer, Margaret Logan, and was sentenced to death. She was executed in April 1947, making her the second of only 4 women to be executed in the California gas chamber. Her final meal consisted of a steak, fries, and a Coca-Cola. Rosa Stinnett. State, Virginia. Date of execution, January 17, 1947. Rosa Stinnett was a 49-year-old root doctor from Williamsburg County who conspired with 3 men to murder her husband. She was electrocuted on January 7, 1947, for her involvement in the crime. Corinne Sykes. State, Pennsylvania. Date of execution, October 14, 1946. Sykes was a 20-year-old African-American housemaid who murdered her employer, Frida Woodlinger, shortly after being hired on December 7, 1944. She was executed by electrocution in Pennsylvania on October 14, 1946, making her the second woman in the state to receive the death penalty. Lena Baker. State, Georgia. Date of execution, March 5, 1945. Lena Baker was an African-American maid in Cuthbert, Georgia, United States, who was convicted of capital murder of a white man, Ernest Knight. She was executed by the state of Georgia in 1945. She was the only woman in Georgia who died by electrocution. Her last words were, "What I done, I did in self-defense, or I would have been killed myself. Where I was, I could not overcome it. God has forgiven me. I have nothing against anyone. I picked cotton for Mr. Pritchett, and he has been good to me. I am ready to go. I am one in the number. I am ready to meet my God. I have a very strong conscience. Bessie Williams. Date of execution, 1950. Bessie was executed in 1950 in Georgia, USA. Her case drew attention due to the complexities surrounding her conviction and the circumstances of her trial. Williams was convicted of the murder of her husband, Edward Williams, after a violent altercation. The details of the case included issues of domestic abuse, and there were significant debates about whether she acted in self-defense. Despite these arguments, she was sentenced to death. Helen Fowler. State: New York. Date of execution: November 16, 1944. Helen was found guilty of taking part in the murder of a 63-year-old white man named George Fowler with the help of her common-law husband, George Knight. On the evening of his death, George Fowler had been out on the town, apparently boasting about carrying a large sum of cash. Helen Fowler and her partner beat George to death with a hammer to steal his money. She was executed by electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on the 16th of November, 1944, at the age of 37, alongside her partner, George Knight. Helen was the only African-American woman to be electrocuted in New York State during the 20th century. Mildred Johnson. State: Mississippi. Date of execution: May 19, 1944. Mildred Johnson was convicted of murdering her husband, J.P. Johnson, in 1942. She was accused of shooting him during an argument. The case received significant media attention at the time, particularly because of the racial dynamics involved, as her trial and execution took place during a period of considerable racial tension in the United States. Mildred Johnson was executed by electrocution in Mississippi on May 19, 1944. She was a black woman, and her execution marked a significant moment in the state's history, as it was the first execution of a woman in Mississippi since that time. State: South Carolina. Date of execution: January 15, 1943. Sue was connected to the murder of David Timmerman, which occurred on September 17, 1941, in Edgefield County, South Carolina. Initially, there were no suspects. The police thought that the murder was committed by a stranger who ambushed Timmerman in his store. However, a 2-month investigation led to the arrests of Clarence Bagwell, George Logue, Logue's sister-in-law Sue Stidham Logue, and Sue's nephew Joe Frank Logue, who were accused of planning and committing Timmerman's murder in retaliation for the self-defense shooting of George Logue's brother and Sue Logue's husband, John Wallace Logue. On January 15, 1943, Sue Logue, George Logue, and Clarence Bagwell were executed in South Carolina's electric chair, in that order. The executions took place at approximately 7:00 a.m. Sue Logue's execution made her the first woman, albeit not the only one, to be executed in South Carolina's electric chair. Rosanna Phillips. State: North Carolina. Date of execution: January 1, 1943. Rosanna was the first black female executed in North Carolina, along with her partner, Daniel Phillips. They were executed by gas chamber on January 1, 1943, for the murder of a farmer they worked for. There was no record of her last meal and final statement. Tony Joe Henry. State: Louisiana. Date of execution: November 28, 1942. Tony Joe Henry was the only woman ever executed in Louisiana's electric chair. She was married to Claude "Cowboy" Henry and decided to help him escape from prison, where he was serving a 50-year sentence in the Texas State Penitentiary for murder. Alongside Harold Burks, she went for a ride with Joseph P. Calloway, whom they later robbed and killed. Tony Joe was found guilty and sentenced to death. After 3 trials, she was executed by electrocution on November 28, 1942. Her story inspired several popular books and films, including A Savage Wisdom and Stone Justice. Evelita Juanita Spinelli. State: California. Date of execution: November 21, 1941. Juanita, nicknamed the Duchess, was the first woman to be executed by the state of California. She was a gangster and an ex-wrestler. FBI profiler Candace DeLong described Spinelli as a stone-cold psychopath who had no use for anybody other than what she could get out of them. Spinelli, who fled Detroit, settled in San Francisco, where she regularly took in young, delinquent, homeless men. She would cook, clean, and train them to be professional criminals. Spinelli's original execution was delayed for 30 days by Culbert Olson. Following 2 further reprieves, she was executed on November 21, 1941, at the age of 52, in the gas chamber at San Quentin. Anna Marie Hahn. State: Ohio. Date of execution: December 7, 1938. Marie was an American serial killer born in Germany. Between 1933 and 1937, she poisoned 5 older men in Cincinnati. Her last victim was 67-year-old Georg Obendorfer, whom she killed on August 1, 1937, after traveling with him and her son to Colorado Springs, Colorado. According to the police, Obendorfer, a cobbler, died in agony just after Mrs. Hahn had bent over his deathbed, inquiring his name, professing she did not know the man. Hahn's son testified during her trial that they all traveled together by train from Cincinnati and that Obendorfer started becoming ill during the trip. After a 4-week trial in November 1937, she was convicted. Sentenced to death, she faced the electric chair at the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus on December 7, 1938. She was buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery in Columbus. Marie Porter. State: Illinois. Date of execution: January 28, 1938. Marie Porter was convicted of the murder of her husband, whom she killed in 1936. She shot him multiple times and then attempted to cover up the act. The case drew significant attention, not only because of its violent nature, but also due to the ongoing debates about the death penalty and the treatment of women in the justice system. Ultimately, after her conviction, she was sentenced to death, leading to her execution in 1938. She was 37 years old at the time and became the first woman to die in the electric chair in Illinois. She was the second woman ever executed in the state. Mary Holmes. State: Mississippi. Date of execution: April 29, 1937. Mary Holmes was convicted of her husband's death, Julius Holmes, in 1936. Their relationship was tumultuous, marked by allegations of domestic abuse. The circumstances leading to her trial involved claims that she killed him in self-defense after a violent altercation. Mary Holmes was executed by hanging on April 29, 1937, in Rolling Fork, Mississippi. She was the last woman to be judicially hanged in the United States. At the time of her execution, she was 35 years old and of African descent. There was no record of a last meal or final statement. Mary Frances Creighton. Stated date of execution: July 16, 1936. Mary was an American woman convicted and executed for murder by poisoning. Creighton was nicknamed the Long Island Borgia and the Black-Eyed Borgia by the press because of her use of arsenic poisoning. Scheduled to sit on the electric chair, Creighton was imprisoned at Sing Sing Prison to await execution. On the fixed day, Creighton was suffering from hysterical paralysis and was given a morphine injection. Some reports state that she was completely unconscious when the electric chair was turned on. Eva Curry. State: New York. Date of execution: June 27, 1935. Eva moved to New York State in 1921 after marrying her husband, William Koo. While in New York, Eva ran a brothel. She was entrusted with caring for one of her employees, a handyman named Henry Wright, who had learning difficulties. After the death of Wright's mother, Koo embezzled his inheritance and burned his house for the insurance. She then conspired with another employee, Martha Clift, to murder him. On the 14th of June, 1934, the two women drove Wright to a remote location outside Oneonta, New York, where Eva hit him with a mallet and Martha ran him over with a car. They then dumped Wright's body beside the road to simulate a hit-and-run accident. Koo was executed on the 27th of June, 1935 in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison. May Carey. State: Georgetown. Date of execution: June 7, 1935. May was executed by hanging on June 7, 1935, in Georgetown, Delaware, along with her son, Howard. They were convicted for the murder of Robert Hitchens, who was May Carey's brother. May Carey's last meal was cake and ice cream. Julia Moore. State: Louisiana. Date of execution: Julia was hanged in Louisiana for the murder of one Elliot Wilson. Details of the case were private. There was no record of her last meal and final words. Anna Antonio. State: date of execution: August 9, 1934. Anna Antonio's trial stemmed from the murder of her husband, Charles Antonio, in 1933. After enduring years of abuse, she allegedly hired a hitman, Tony Marino, to carry out the crime. Marino murdered Charles by mixing poison into his food. Anna's involvement and the circumstances of the murder led to her arrest and subsequent trial. She was executed by electrocution on August 9, 1934. The case garnered significant attention due to its sensational nature during the Depression. Anna Antonio requested no last meal, saying, "I want nothing." Irene Schroeder. State: Pennsylvania. Date of execution: February 23, 1931. Irene was an American criminal who became the first woman to be electrocuted in Pennsylvania. She was given several nicknames by the press, including Trigger Woman, Iron Irene, Irene of the Six Shooters, Animal Woman, the Blonde Tiger, the Blonde Bandit, and Tiger Girl. Schroeder was electrocuted on February 23, 1931, at 7:05 a.m., wearing a gray dress of imitation silk with white collars and cuffs, beige silk stockings, and black satin slippers, to her death. Her executioner, Robert G. Elliott, remarked that she seemed composed and fearless. Her parting words to her 6-year-old son, Donnie, were, "I am going to die, my boy, but I am not afraid. Be a good boy, and don't be afraid." Donnie was heard to remark, "I'll bet my mom would make an awful nice angel." Eva Dugan. State: Arizona. Date of execution: February 21, 1930. Eva Dugan was a convicted murderer whose execution by hanging at the state prison in Florence, Arizona, resulted in her decapitation and influenced the state of Arizona to replace hanging with the lethal gas chamber as a method of execution. A day before the hanging, there were rumors that she planned to kill herself first. Her cell was searched, and a bottle of raw ammonia and 3 razor blades hidden in a dress were confiscated. Dugan's appeal for clemency on the grounds of mental illness was denied. She cooked her last meal in her cell and played cards with other inmates until midnight. She was taken to the gallows at 5 a.m. on February 21, 1930. At 5:11, the trapdoor opened and the hanging was carried out. The rope snapped tight, beheading the woman instantly. Her head rolled to a stop at the feet of the horrified onlookers while her heart continued to beat, pumping blood from her severed neck for several minutes. The gruesome scene was too much for some of the witnesses to handle, causing 5 of them to faint. This execution was one of the last hangings to take place in Arizona, with Dugan being one of the individuals involved. Selena Gilmore. State: Alabama. Date of execution: January 24, 1930. Selena Gilmore was convicted of murdering her husband, Charlie Gilmore, with arsenic. She poisoned his coffee over some time to have his life insurance policy. At the time of the crime, she was 20-year-old. Her case gained significant attention, and she became the first woman to be executed in Alabama in nearly 30 years. Ada LaBeouf. State: Louisiana. Date of execution: February 1, 1929. A 38-year-old middle-class Louisiana housewife and mother of 4 children, Ada LeBoeuf was having an affair with the family doctor T.E. Dreyer. Together, Ada and her lover hired a trapper, James Beadle, to shoot dead her husband, Jim LeBoeuf, a power plant superintendent in Morgan City. Beadle was sentenced to life, whilst Ada LeBoeuf and Dreyer were both sentenced to death by hanging. On the day of her execution, Ada stepped on the gallows trap door, clasped her hands in prayer, and a high-pitched, trembling voice said, "Don't let me hang there too long. Don't make me suffer any more than I have to." Oh God, isn't this a terrible thing? Oh God, who can do this thing? It is worse than murder itself. There was no record of her last meal. May Ruth Snyder. State, New York. Date of execution, January 12, 1928. Ruth was an American murderer. Her execution in the electric chair at New York's Sing Sing prison in 1928 for the murder of her husband, Albert Snyder, was recorded in a highly publicized photograph. Ruth went to the electric chair 10 minutes before Judd Gray, her former lover. Her execution was surreptitiously photographed at the moment electricity was running through her body, with the aid of a miniature plate camera strapped to the ankle of Tom Howard, a Chicago Tribune photographer working in cooperation with the Tribune-owned New York Daily News. Her last words were reported to be, "Mother, mother, mother!" exclamation mark. There was no record of her last meal. Patty Perdue. State, Mississippi. Date of execution, January 13, 1922. Patty was convicted for the murder of her husband, Ira Perdue, in 1921. Patty was executed on January 13, 1922, in Whitesboro Jail. To prevent her from seeing the gallows, a hole was cut in the upstairs floor for the rope. Virginia Christian. State, Virginia. Date of execution, August 16, 1912. Christian was an African-American teenager executed by the state of Virginia. Convicted of first-degree murder for killing her white employer, Ida Bellotti, she became the only female minor executed in the United States in the 20th century. Before her execution, Christian wrote to her family and supporters, "I know that I am getting no more than I deserve. I am prepared to answer for my sins, and I believe that the Lord has forgiven me. I fear that Mrs. Bellotti may not have been Christian. I blame no one for my situation. I hope to meet Mrs. Bellotti in heaven. I thank all who have worked on my behalf." Christian was electrocuted in the state prison in Richmond at 7:23 a.m. on August 16, 1912, 5 months after Bellotti's death and 1 day after her 7th birthday. She received 3 electric shocks, although the Richmond Times-Dispatch reported she died after the first. Mary Farmer. State, New York. Date of execution, March 29, 1909. Mary was an American woman who was executed by electrocution in New York on March 29, 1909, for the murder and dismemberment of her neighbor and friend, Sarah. She is notable for being the second woman to die in the electric chair in New York. Her last words were, "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, have mercy on my soul." Mary Rogers. State, Vermont. Date of execution, December 8, 1905. Mary was a 21-year-old white housewife who walked calmly to the gallows for the chloroform murder of her husband, Marcus, on August 13, 1902. She wanted rid of him so that she could have another man and also get his life insurance of $400. The execution took place just after 1 p.m. at Windsor in Vermont, on a gallows erected in a closed courtyard in the prison. Mary was the second and last woman to be hanged in Vermont. Dora Wright. State, Oklahoma. Date of execution, July 17, 1903. Dora was executed by hanging in Oklahoma on July 7, 1903, for the murder and mutilation of a 7-year-old girl named Annie Williams. Dora Wright's last words were, "Don't make it quite so tight." This was just before her execution when a jailer adjusted her noose. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help more cases like this to light, kindly hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives.